start with the first presentation by our guest speaker, Professor Heeger from New York University, graduated in 1983 from the University of Pennsylvania. During his undergrad studies, he got involved in projects of vision science, and he got his master and PhD degrees from the same University of Pennsylvania in 85 and 87, respectively, on that topic. On that same year, in 87, he received the first ever MAR prize, the most prestigious prize that you can obtain in computer vision, for his work on optical flow with spatio-temporal filters. Then as a postdoc at MIT, he made fundamental contributions to neural computation and neuroscience with its normalization model. In 1990, he joined NASA Ames in California and then the faculty of Stanford, where he was a pioneer in combining perceptual psychology, neuroscience, and image processing in fMRI imaging. He gave a number of contributions in the understanding of the dynamics of the brain regions activities during human tasks. And in 2002, he joined NYU, where he became involved in a large interdisciplinary group in neuroscience, psychology, and computer science. And where, again, he made very important contributions to computational methods for understanding brain activity. He became member of the National Academy of Science of the United States in 2013. And for all of that, that's a great pleasure for us to have you with us this morning at CIMAT for this celebration of José Luis. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Thank you. I think I'm mic'd here, right? Is that okay? Everybody can hear me okay? All right, good. So the title here is about the brain, but really this is a signal processing talk. Okay? So for many years, with some of my close colleagues, Eero Simoncelli, Ted Adelson, many others, we've been using tools from signal processing, image processing, computer vision to try to reverse engineer how the brain works. So that's really what this is, what this is about. And everything I'm going to tell you today was published just this year, and as you'll see, was very much motivated by the work of Jose, who's of course represented in the background here. Okay, in the background throughout the whole talk. So just to motivate the question, the problem, I'm going to show you a movie from an excerpt from a Charlie Chaplin movie backwards, and the point is, I want you to try and figure out what's happening in this little video clip. Watching it backwards. Okay, so here it goes. Now, most people find it to be kind of confusing. Your brain is working to try to understand what's going on. So keep in mind the interpretation that you had watching the backwards movie, and now you're going to watch the forwards movie. Here it goes. Okay, all right. So a completely for most people, I think, a completely different interpretation, right? So there's something about how the brain processes information about the world in which time is fundamental. The order in which sequence of events unfolds has an enormous impact on the way that you comprehend everything that's going on around you. So that got me and my colleagues thinking about that the brain must do something, some kind of processing that accumulates information over time and tries to predict into the future, and then combine those predictions with the new incoming sensory information in some kind of a loop. And we did some, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this is with a former postdoc, Uri Hassan, who's now at Princeton, we did some brain imaging experiments a number of years ago in which we measured the amount of time, the time window over which different brain areas accumulate information. And there's a hierarchy. In the early visual processing areas of the brain, information is accumulated over only very short time periods. And in later brain areas, as the processing gets more complex and more abstract, the information is accumulated over longer periods of time. And so this got me wondering, really since then, almost a decade, how is it that, what's the computation? What's the nature of the computation that the brain is using to accumulate information over time and predict into the future? And the only example that I had to work from or to think about is the familiar Kalman filter, which does something like that. It accumulates information over time and predicts forward in time, and then combines that with new input, from whatever the device is that's being controlled. But it just seems too simplistic, right? For a Kalman filter to work, you need to have a model of the dynamical system that you're controlling, and the world is a pretty complicated, thing to model, particularly in the video interactions with other people. So it just doesn't seem right. So prediction requires a model. So I grabbed these from recent news events. The models can be pretty complicated, but nonetheless, what we do in interacting in our environment is yet even more complicated than that. So where might we begin? Well, so there's some motivation for this from the success in recent years with deep convolutional neural nets that I think, as you all know, have had a really surprising capability of modeling complicated systems. So this is an example of applying a deep convolutional neural net in the domain of computer vision and object recognition. And you know what the basic structure is. I'm sure most of you do, that you have an input image. You do a bunch of convolutions, some nonlinearity, rectification, or maybe a quadratic squaring nonlinearity, which I'll use. And then you repeat that operation. Each of those, set of convolutions, nonlinearity, set of convolutions, nonlinearity. And this is able to extract almost magically, although there's some progress in understanding what it is that these systems do, at the output, a representation, a collection of numbers. Just think of it as a vector of some features being represented. And then you can apply a classification, simple linear classifier on that to classify what kind of object it was. Okay, so that seems like, although maybe we don't fully understand how these kinds of models work, that seems like maybe it's a model of the right kind of complexity to at least capture some aspects of the complexity of the real world. But it doesn't have anything in it about time and prediction. Okay? So the idea here is to try and put together hierarchical models of this sort with a hierarchy of time scales that would go along with each of the different stages, each of the different layers of the deep net in order to accumulate information over time and predict forward in time. So then what I needed was some mechanism for rolling things forward in time, for predicting forward in time. And so just to get started with a very simple example, let's forget about the whole hierarchy and just do it with one layer. Okay? And think about the following problem. I have this signal, that's my input, and I want to get this blue curve out as the output, which matches the input up to the present times 0, and then keeps going forward, somehow predicting forward. And the green curve here which is which is essentially the Hilbert transform of the blue curve, the quadrature pair to the blue curve is going to come along for the ride. And so some of you probably already know where this is going. It's this. I remember reading this paper way back now, 20 years ago, and being really excited about it. Neat idea. And this is the application here was in imaging in space, and the idea of it is to clean up an image, reduce noise, and fill in missing information using a regularization term, which is frequency modulated. And so here's what that looks like in the way that I formulated it. So I took the idea from this paper and turned it into the following thing. So I'm setting up the prediction, this problem, how do I get this blue curve to extend forward in time from that, as the following optimization. So I want to minimize this thing, which is the sum of two terms. There's one term here and another term over here. And the first term has in it, well, that's the input. So that's my that's this. Okay, that's the input right there. This is the sum of a number of output functions, each of which has a subscript m, which determines the different frequencies of basis functions. So this is basically a Fourier basis set, like a Fourier basis set. It's really damped complex exponentials. Okay. What I want to do here, what this term says, is make the sum of the outputs, this collection, across this Fourier basis set, add them up, and make that be close to the input squared. And what this term is about is make the inputs here again. So that's going to be my real part of the output. Sorry. And my imaginary part of the output, the blue curve and the green curve, make each of those be close to a prediction, which I'm calling y hat. And again, all of these things are indexed by m, which are these different frequency components, which you can think of as different terms in a Fourier series expansion. And I'm using subscripts 1 and 2 to refer to the real part and the imaginary part. When I first submitted the paper for publication, the neuroscience reviewers didn't like the complex exponentials, and they made me turn it into sines and cosines, which I did. Okay, but I know that you'd all probably prefer, as I do, the complex exponentials. Okay, so this is make the output be close to a prediction from the previous time step, and this is make the output be close to the input. And there's also a state parameter here that I'm calling lambda, or this weight on the regularization. And if lambda is 1, then all we care about is this term. If lambda is 0, then all we care about is that term. And lambda values in between will give you a trade-off between making the output be close to the input or being close to the prediction. So what are these prediction terms? Well, they look like this. They're weighted sums of the previous time step, and the weights are determined just by sines and cosines. So that's where your Fourier basis comes in. And for each different subscript m, I have a different frequency here. So I could choose one frequency component and have one subscript m, or I could choose a whole bunch of different frequency components, or I could choose the entire Fourier expansion if I wanted to. So for those of you who are familiar with this paper, you can see that it's exactly the same thing. All I did was replace x space with time t, okay? And I replaced what in that paper was just a single frequency modulated regularizer with a sum of a whole bunch of them here, in which I can now choose as many frequency components as I want. Okay? And so the way that it works is we're modeling this simple, one-dimensional problem with a set of basis functions, which are just sinusoids. And so, if you have a sinusoid, it's actually really easy to predict it forward in time. So that's a really simple model for predicting forward signals. And if you have a signal which is a sum of sinusoids, well, then you can predict forward each of the individual sinusoids. And of course, you can write any signal as a sum of a bunch of sinusoids. So we ought to be in pretty good shape here. Okay? And sure enough, here's an example of how that works. Again, this is the input, that's the output. Here's the different terms corresponding to those different subscript m's. The input in this case is a simple sum of two frequency components, one at 2 hertz, another one at 8 hertz. And one of the things that's just really cool about this is that you get the quadrature, the imaginary part comes along for free, right? So that's the green curve here. Is coming along for the ride, which just gets generated in the process of doing this optimization, right? So over here, the input is real, so I'm only looking at the subscript 1, the real part of the outputs, which are complex numbers here. But the real and imaginary parts are all over there. So we get the quadrature pair for free, and that's the green. So this blue curve here is the sum of the blue curves there. This green curve here is the sum of the green curves there. The red curve here is the sum of the squares of the green and the blue. So that's just looking at the energy or the amplitude over time. And by choosing different values for that lambda parameter, for that state parameter, we end up with different, essentially, frequency responses, bandwidths, for these, for these basis functions, for the behavior of these basis functions. For a fixed value of lambda, it behaves like a shift invariant linear system. You're just convolving with functions that look like these damped oscillators. And what I actually did here was I used one value of lambda. Oops, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. One value of lambda for computing this up until this moment in time, so that the output was closely tracking the input. And then I switched the state and switched the value of lambda to allow it to predict forward in time. This particular example calculation is a global batch optimization doing gradient descent on all of the time points all at once. So as if you have memory of all of the input going all the way back in time. But you can also compute it incrementally, and that's what's shown here in a couple of different examples. So here, again, this is the input. It's modulating like this up until time 0, and then it's 0 after that. And this is how the output kind of ramps up over time, now just using one previous time point and a few iterations of gradient descent, and then you grab the next input and do it again, okay, incrementally over time. And it follows it over past time and then starts predicting forward. Of course, depending on the value of lambda that you use, your prediction, again, it's a damped oscillator, it'll eventually return back to 0. Okay? So for one value of lambda here, that returns back to 0, more quickly. For a different value of lambda, it extends it out further in time. All right? So that's the simple 1D example. Now we want to put that back into this whole hierarchy. So far this is what we've done, is a kind of recursive regularization for time series prediction motivated by Jose's work. So let's try and take it a step further. All right, I'm not going to solve the Charlie Chaplin video. That's too hard. But let's take it one step more complicated and try to deal with something like this. So here's a simple video of a very predictable visual stimulus, a grading pattern that's moving back and forth in time. I'm just going to care about one dimension in space because it makes it easier to illustrate it. So we're going to do everything now going forward with just x and t. So this is one dimension of space, ignoring the y dimension because it's just redundant, and time, and that's my input. And what I want to do is be able to, so it's moving back and forth, and I want to be able to extend that forward in time. Okay. If I can move the slide forward. Yeah. Okay. So I want to give a quick review, if I can, of how visual motion processing works in the brain. What do we know about that? All right. For those of you who don't know anything about neuroscience, visual neuroscience, that's okay. This will all be very familiar. So in primary visual cortex, there's millions of neurons that receive input ultimately from the eye, from the retina of the eye. Each of those neurons responds to a local patch of the visual field. Okay, so if you were recording the electrical responses of a neuron over here in this part of my brain, it would respond to a little region of the visual field over there. Okay, that's called its receptive field. Each of these individual neurons is selective for different kinds of visual patterns. So, for example, you might find one neuron, as illustrated here, that responds only to this one orientation and doesn't respond well to these other orientations. You can measure how its response depends on how its response here, the number of action potentials it fires depends on the orientation of the stimulus. Okay? And the way that we think of that is the way that you usually do in image processing and computer vision, just as a linear operator, in which the neuron is computing a weighted sum with, say, positive weights here and negative weights there of the underlying image intensities. So in this case, it'll give a big response because there's a feature with positive weight and nothing in the flanks. Here it would give a zero response because the horizontal feature gives you inputs both positive and negatively weighted, and likewise over here, there's just a blank background. And then the way that we think about it is that there's a whole bunch of neurons that all have the same preference, say all for vertical, that their receptive fields tile the visual field, and we think of that as literally being just like a convolution, okay, a sequence of weighted sums covering the visual field, and I'll call that a channel. And then there's another collection of neurons that, say, respond to each different orientation as well, horizontal, diagonal, different diagonal, and there's a whole bunch of those that tile the visual field and make another channel that we can think of as convolution. And they're arranged in an orderly manner in the brain. There's an actual map across the surface of the brain of locations in the visual field, and for each little bit of brain tissue, there's a bunch of neurons that all respond to the same location with different orientation preferences. Okay? So that's almost everything you need to know about the brain here. These neurons not only respond selectively to orientation, but also to direction of motion. So here's an example of a diagonal feature that's being moved through the receptive field of one of these neurons, and when it moves up and to the right, you get a discharge of these action potentials, electrical signals. When it's moving down and to the left, you get nothing. Okay? And then as before, it's orientation dependent as well. It doesn't respond to verticals or horizontals regardless of which direction it goes. And we think of that in exactly the same way because orientation in space-time is a perfectly good way to think about motion. So if you were to imagine taking a very simple visual stimulus, a video, of a vertical line that's moving to the right over time. Imagine taking an old-fashioned movie. You could clip out the frames and stack them up on top of one another. You'd get a space-time cube. So this is X, Y, and time running forward out of the screen. It starts off on the left, ends up at the right, and sweeps out in this space-time volume. If you were to look at that from above and lay it down flat in X and T, that's the present, that's the past, that's the future, and you can see that the motion is orientation in space-time. If it were stationary, it would be vertical. If it were moving from right to left, it would go that way. Okay? So in the same way that we can design a linear filter that is selective for the orientation in an image, we can define a space-time linear filter that is selective for the orientation and direction of motion. You can just see this in a real video here. This is one of these standard MPEG coding test videos. Here's an image in XY, and this is showing you the XT slice. You can see the orientation in XT. All right, so you can design a space-time oriented filter. This one, so it's a weighted sum of the intensities in the video sequence over space and recently passed time with a tilt over time, so that this one responds to left to right motion, but not to right to left motion. Okay? And there's neurophysiological evidence for this. It turns out to also be convenient to do this calculation in such a way that you get the envelope of the motion information. If we just stopped with this kind of operation here, as the stimulus moves over time, you'll get a modulated signal out. And the amplitude of modulation here will be large and here will be small, but it's still modulated. You can demodulate it by having a quadrature pair of filters, which is drawn here. So I have two space-time oriented filters, one of which is even phase, the other of which is odd phase. I take the sum of the squares, and this was called by Ted Adelson and Jim Bergen motion energy, because the output of this thing depends on the local space-time spectral energy of the stimulus and throws away the local phase information. So now for left to right motion, you get an elevated signal out. For right to left motion, you get 0. Okay? And that's what I'm illustrating here, is that for this particular phase of the input, you get a big response out of this one, no response out of that one. But if you shift the phase a little bit, here you get a 0 response out of that one, but a big response out of that one. So regardless of what the phase is, once you take the sum of the squares, you get a strong motion direction signal out. Okay? So some of these, right. Okay. So if we were to apply that idea to our input, compute motion energy, forget about this for a second and forget about the green curves for a second, you would get something that looked like this blue curve for the rightward selective filters, and something that looks like this blue curve for the leftward selective filters, okay? In which, so the motion is right, then left, then right, then left. You can see strong signal, then small signal, then strong signal, then small signal, okay? So that's a start. And now we have a piece of at least a feed-forward hierarchical calculation that does part of what we want to do. All right. So that's where we are right now. So we have this feed-forward processing model of motion energy. All right. Now I want to take that and want to take what we also did before and put them together. And the way in which I want to put them together is to notice that once we're down here in this representation, right? And imagine that I had these green guys, which I'll show you where these green curves come from. Those are the quadrature pairs that we get for free. The representation here of the oscillating motion is much simpler than the representation here of how the image intensities change over time, right? So we have, a sort of a higher order or more abstract model of what the input was. And the game plan is to try to take this simpler, higher level, think about it in your deep net, a higher level, more abstract representation that in some ways is simpler, and use that to constrain the way that the early representation predicts things forward. So that's the other piece of this. Remember that there's this hierarchy of processing stages with different temporal scales of processing and different levels of abstraction. And the idea, kind of like what a deep net does, is to use those more abstract representations to somehow feed that information back in order to constrain the predictions forward at the earlier representation. So we need to be able to add that, and that's going to be the next part. So now I'm going to go back to kind of the format of a deep net, forget about time for a minute, and talk about how to do inference in a multi-layered recurrent net, similar to a deep net. And to motivate this, those of you who haven't seen this image before, you probably can't tell what it is until I explain to you that it's a dog sniffing the ground. That's the dog's head. That's the ear, right? And that's the body. This is the hind leg. That's the front legs there, sniffing the ground near the base of the shadow of a tree, which is over here. Okay. And now that you know that, someone could show you this image, which is attributed to Richard Gregory, although the original version of it was a photograph that was published in Life magazine sometime in the 1960s. So now that you've seen this, if someone shows you this image 10 years from now, you'll recognize it instantly as a Dalmatian dog sniffing the ground near a tree. Now, so that's pretty wild because what your visual system is doing here is there's a bunch of black and white spots. That's all there is. That could be perceptually organized in any of a great number of different ways. But you have this prior knowledge that you're recalling from memory that this is a Dalmatian dog sniffing the ground near a tree, and somehow that abstract representation that you're pulling out of your long-term memory, right, constrains the low-level perceptual organization. Okay, so this is analogous just in space to the motion temporal problem that I was just talking about. Somehow an abstract high-level representation is constraining the low-level processing near the sensory input. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we want to take again something that starts off being kind of like a deep net, this hierarchy of processing states that gives me an abstract representation out here, right? So there's some set of numbers, a vector of numbers, some set of features that we can then plug into a linear classifier and be able to say that this is a flower and not a tree and not a Dalmatian dog, right? But we want to go both directions. We want to be able to do the bottom-up processing, but we also want to be able to say, I remember that this is supposed to be a flower, so use that, a vector at the output, to constrain the processing at the input. Okay, and the intuition for how to do this comes from these crazy images that were all over the internet a couple years ago of these Google Deep Dream images. Okay, and here's what they did. What they did is they took a trained deep net that was trained to recognize, dogs and cats and flowers and cups. And they took an input image. In this case, this is the input image. And they said, okay, I'm going to use that image as the input. And I'm also going to specify at the output that I want this thing to be classified as a dog. It might have been a sheep in this case, whatever. Choose whatever you want. And then make the image, change the image pixels so that the output that you get is the desired feature vector. So this is gradient descent on the image pixels to give you an output feature vector that matches the category you want to be in. Okay? And so that's the notion of how you can maybe use the output to constrain what you want at the input. And in fact, it's not a new idea. So I did something similar way back in '95, but this was like a one-layer deep net, not very deep. What we did was a texture analysis synthesis algorithm that was published in SIGGRAPH, Computer Graphics Conference, in which we used banks of linear filters, a subband image transform to collect statistics about an image, and then started with a noise image well, white noise in each of the color bands, so RGB white noise, and then essentially did gradient descent on the pixels to get it to match the desired image statistics. And here's a few other examples of that. On the left, these are input images. These are matched textures. Notice that it's not the same image. It's just an image that has the same statistics. It's an image that has the same desired feature vector output in this case, which is just the marginal distribution of these texture statistics in each of the subbands. Okay, and then there's been more stuff since then. Okay, all right. So this is a reminder of how a deep net works. So you have a bunch of feature maps or channels, each of which gets subjected to a bunch of convolutions, and you do that from one layer to the next. And we can think of the calculation as looking like this. From each layer, you compute weighted sums. That's your convolutions. So the W's are the weights. The V's are the output of the weighted sums. I'm going to use a squaring nonlinearity just to keep things simple, and also because it fits along nicely with the whole motion energy thing that I was talking about a couple minutes ago. And then that's the next layer out. Okay? So the Y's are the responses of these individual units or neurons. The superscript I tells you what layer you're in, and the subscript tells you which unit or neuron you correspond to in each layer. So that's the feed-forward calculation. To do what I want to do is to kind of combine that with this gradient descent on the input. I came up with the following kind of diagram to illustrate what the optimization scheme looks like. In some ways, it's similar. There's this feed-forward drive that's going to look like weighted sums of the inputs. And that's going to affect the output. But there's also other things that are going on. There's feedback from the layer above that comes back, and there's going to be a prior, which for the moment, which is this y hat, which for the moment is just a target number that I'm going to pick, going to set by hand for each individual neuron in each layer. Later, when we get back to the whole motion prediction thing, this is actually going to be computed recurrently, recursively in just the same way that I did with the 1D example, okay, with the Fourier damped oscillator basis set. Okay, but for the time being, it's just a fixed number. And here's what the optimization looks like using the same kind of form that we've already seen. I want to minimize this thing. It's a sum of two terms. One term is a feed-forward drive, which is make the output look like what is z. Z is the square of the weighted sum. Okay, so make the output response of this unit at this layer be like this thing, which is a weighted sum of the previous layer, then squared. Okay, and also make the output yj at layer I be like this prior. That's this term over here. And again, I have the lambda here, the 1 minus lambda here, and I also have another state parameter alpha out front, which will allow me to put different amounts of weighting on different layers. Okay? And I'm summing this over all of the layers and over all of the units within each layer. So you can think of this as being a sum over space and over layers in the hierarchy of processing. Okay, so that's the thing that I'm optimizing, and the algorithm I'm using is a simple gradient descent, and so the idea is that each individual unit updates its response, okay, according to the current feed-forward drive, what I'll show you in a second, the feedback drive and this prior. And so each individual unit is doing this local calculation, but when they're all done, they end up doing this global optimization over everything. So you take the derivative of that energy function optimization criterion E, and it looks like this. You end up now with three terms. This is one that depends on just the same feed-forward drive I talked about a moment ago. This is the same prior drive that I talked about a moment ago. This new one appears. This is the feedback drive, and that drops out by the chain rule because the if you think of what this term looks like one layer up at the I plus 1 layer, the derivative with respect to I, y superscript I, is down here, right? If we're one layer up, this is a superscript I, which is going to feed into the z. Okay, so there's another term that you get there from the I plus 1 layer when you write out the derivative. Maybe it's and it ends up looking like this. So the feedback drive depends on the response at one layer above and the weights that go from the layer you're in to the above to the one above it. The intuition for this is I think the following, that this term is all about taking care of the second term in what I'm trying to optimize. Okay, and these two together fight with one another to take care of the first term. Remember, the first term is all about making the output look like whatever the input tells you it's supposed to be, but both from layer I minus 1 to layer I, and also from layer I to layer I plus 1. And what this is doing is it's saying, if I'm feeding forward information to you, and the number that you get is too big, according to what you're expecting, according to your current responses and your prior, then you tell me, hey, turn down the volume a little bit. And I say to you, well, okay, I'll do that, but if you turn up your output a little bit. So it's a little negotiation that takes place. Okay? All right. So here's a simple example of implementing that with the world's simplest neural net that's computing just it's like an exclusive OR operation. So I'm taking weighted sum. So the feed-forward calculation is I take 1 times this, and minus 1 times that, I add it together and square it. So that'll behave, for binary inputs, that'll behave like an XOR, right? And so if the input here is 1, 0, 0, 0, then you get a 1 here, you get a 0 there, 1 and 0, you do that again, you get a 1 up here, okay? And that's if it were done in an entirely feed-forward way. But I can also plug in a value for the prior for each of these. Okay, so in the case I'm showing you here, I'm specifying the prior for this guy to be 0. It's also 0 for each of the other ones here. Okay, but the state parameters are set such that this really just behaves like a feed-forward thing, right? So if I were to set the lambda values as I did here to 1, then that puts all the weight on make the output look like the feed-forward drive from the input and completely ignore the prior. And sure enough, that's how it behaves. So that what I'm graphing here are the responses of each of these things over time as we do this gradient descent. And this guy goes up first, and the other ones get shut down to 0, and then this one comes up next, and then finally that one comes up. Okay, but I can change the state parameters and now run it in an entirely feedback mode. So now the state parameters are set to pay a lot of attention to the prior and put a lot of weight on the top layer. So now what's going to happen is it drives this guy up to a response of 1 first, which pushes one of these two to have a value of 1, which then pushes one of these two to have a value of 1 and pushes the other ones down to 0. So I can run this thing in either mode. I can run it like a feed-forward neural net, or I can run it like a feedback deep dream. Okay? Or I can do something in between that looks, in fact, a lot like a Bayesian inference. And in some versions of it, it in fact approximates Bayesian inference. And that's what this figure in the paper is about, but I'm not going to take the time to go through it. Okay, so now we have all the pieces. We have this recursive regularization in one layer. We know how to do feed-forward processing of motion. And we know how to now feed information back and forth through a multi-layered hierarchy. And so we're almost done. In fact, I think basically we're done. Just have to put these things together. And we've already seen it all. We've already seen all the pieces. So I'm literally using the form of multi-layered network that I already described. This is what the diagram of what the calculation looks like. Instead of the y now being a target value that I'm setting by hand, the y hat is going to be exactly what it was when I started. It's going to be this thing that's rolling forward in time, being computed with these sinusoid and cosinusoid basis functions, which I'm now here finally allowing myself to write as properly as complex exponentials. So, okay, you can rest easy about that. So now it's a summation over all the layers, over all the units in each layer, over time of a first term here, make the sum of the real parts of the output at each layer look like the feed-forward drive. In this term, make each of the outputs in each layer look like y hat, the prediction from the previous time step. The prediction from the previous time step is just a weighted sum, of t minus delta t, where the weights are these damped oscillators. Sure enough, at least for this simple example that I've been using, I was able to get it to work. So I provide this, something that looks like this is the input. I do a first pre-processing step, which I think of as being kind of a cheap model of what the retina does, which is just to apply a biphasic temporal filter. And that gives me, the input to layer 1. This is going to be what the output of layer 1 looks like. It follows the input up to this point in time and then predicts further forward in time. Even though there's only a single temporal filter here, remember the quadrature pairs come along for free. And so there's not only this, but there's also there's the imaginary part of that, which looks just like it but phase shifted. Okay? For each of those, I apply a pair of spatial filters, okay, in quadrature phase. From those, I compute weighted sums to get these space-time oriented filters. I square them and add them together to get motion energy. But again, I'm doing it in the context of this recurrent and recursive network, so I get the quadrature pairs of those as well, and that's where these green curves come from. The blue ones is what I'd get if I was just doing the feed-forward calculation. And I'm modeling this with 2 of these frequency components. So I'm not using a whole Fourier basis set. I'm just using the DC, is the frequency of one of them, and the other one has a frequency of 1 hertz, which is the frequency of the oscillation, not the frequency of the underlying, not the temporal frequency of the underlying. If you were to just look at a single slice here in time, you'd get a complex time series that would have a whole bunch of frequency components in it. Okay, this is just the frequency of the back and forth oscillation. And the idea is that that these different pieces in the different layers negotiate with one another, and that the simple representation up here of there being something kind of constant happening over time feeds back and constrains how this predicts forward in time. Okay, so that's the story. It's really just a starting point in thinking about how the brain actually does this. These are very simple examples that I picked by hand because I knew that I could make them work. One can imagine ways of taking this further, but it's the starting point of a theory of how the brain not only extracts complicated abstract representations of the world, but can also predict them forward in time. For doing inference and for doing prediction and for doing signal processing with this recurrent and recursive network. These state parameters, the alpha and the lambda, I think actually really correspond to things that could be measured in the brain. And lots of stuff that one could do next, including adding a machine learning kind of piece to this, right? None of that was in there. To learn what the weights are for a given corpus of inputs. And I think it's possible that the form of that could end up being, in a way, simpler than the usual backpropagation, because there's all of this information locally, right? So the idea is that each individual unit or neuron within this system at each layer is making a prediction forward in time of what its response should be an instant later. And that can be compared with what its response actually is. And that difference locally could be used to update the weights, the spatial weights and the temporal weights, for that unit, without having to do this whole back propagation through the whole network. And that in the machine learning literature is similar to what people have occasionally called target propagation instead of back propagation. Although nobody's using that because it's been very difficult to get it to work. This might be hard, but it's interesting. Okay, and the other thing that makes it interesting is that it's unsupervised, right? The idea here is you just provide a corpus of videos, say, or speech signals or music signals, and have it learn the spatial and temporal weights in an unsupervised manner, just based on trying to predict what the have each unit predict what its output is going to be at the next moment in time. So that's it, and I hope it's clear the extent to which this paper really, really, really motivated my thinking on this work. Literally, I was puzzling over, so how can you, make a guess about what's going to be happening later in time? You don't have any data on it. And I was sort of loosely reminded of the regularization work that was going on at MIT when Jose was a graduate student there, right? A master's student, then a PhD student, about regularization for filling in missing data, for example, in a sparse depth map. And I said, no, that's not right, because then you'll just end up with things that are smooth. And then it dawned on me, oh yeah, there was that cool paper in which they frequency modulated the regularizers, right? And if you could do that all at once for a bunch of different frequency components, then you could actually maybe predict forward in time for kind of a complicated looking signal, thanks to Fourier, right? And there it is. So thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. My wife Jenny is here in town with me. She's never been to Mexico before. I only once many years ago for a beach vacation in Playa del Carmen. So it's a pleasure to be here. I feel very honored to be a part of this celebration, and look forward to talking to you and meeting some of you throughout the course of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions, I think. Yeah. Questions?
Thank you very much, David. It was a wonderful talk. And I just want to comment that your paper about optic flow with spatial temporal filters was one of the most inspiring papers, and one that had really a very, very deep influence in my thinking, in my career. And I am very happy. It is great that our own contribution on this variational formulation for the quadrature filters could fit in with that work, to produce this wonderful piece of work that you are talking about today, and which I am sure it will have a deep impact in which people think about these issues. So that was very, very nice. Another thing that, you didn't talk about, but I read your paper, so I cheated. It's about this very intriguing aspect that you can use this variational formulation of yours in terms of modeling bistable stimuli, like a Necker cube and things like that. And that's very nice. And you see, there's a phenomenon that I am very intrigued about, very interested about, in which if you pay attention to your ordinary awareness, moment-to-moment awareness, without any special stimuli, so without thinking, it's not so easy, but just paying attention to what is happening, you find that there is an underlying dynamics, in which saliency is constantly shifting, I was wondering, you could comment a little bit about this, and if you think that some of these ideas could be also used to model this phenomenon.
I do. I think so. Yeah. So we've been friends and fans for decades, but never met before today in person. Okay. So this is very special. But the question is great. I didn't want to take too much time. I love this. Multi-stable perception. So the connection is that the optimization that I set up there is in general a non-convex optimization. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. So the optimization that I set up there is in general a non-convex optimization problem. It's easy to see that. So if you think back to the simple case of the exclusive OR, right? If you had, let's say, 1, 0, 0, 0 at the input, but a 1 as the prior at the output, well, those things are incompatible with one another. So the feed-forward drive is going to push it in one direction, and the feedback drive is going to push it in another direction. Okay, and if you set the state parameters to intermediate values so that it's not driven fully feed-forward and not driven fully feedback, then it has to find some intermediate ground, and there's 2 local minima in that case. Okay, so the idea is, how can you solve that kind of a non-convex optimization problem? Well, there's a whole set of stochastic optimization algorithms that I call all sort of simulated annealing, and the idea is just that the brain, the hypothesis is that the brain literally explores the optimization or energy landscape by purposefully adding noise to the neural responses, right? And that'll bounce it out of a local minima, and then you turn the variance of the noise back down again, or turn the temperature, the analog of the temperature back down again. It'll maybe fall back into the same local optimization minimum, or maybe fall into a different one. And so here's that very example that I was just describing, in which you have 1, 0, 1, 0 as the input, but a 1 as the prior on the output. So this wants the output to be 0, but this wants the output to be 1, and so they're fighting against one another. And then I added non-stationary noise. So the noise standard deviation changes over time, and you can see that the response of this unit stays up here, close to what the prior is telling it to. The responses of these guys are plotted here. The blue one and the red one stay close to 1. The green one and the cyan one stay close to 0, except that there are these moments in time where the noise amplitude is large enough that it allows it to flip. And in the middle range here, you see it flips from 1, 0 to 0, 1, and then back to 1, 0, and later it'll flip back to 0, 1. So the hypothesis is that there's not a single interpretation for what's going on in the world around you most of the time, right? Oftentimes, if you have a strong enough prior, that will constrain the sensory input, and that there's a reasonable, global optimum that you fall into. But a lot of time, that's not true, and the brain has to use some kind of an active process to explore what the different alternatives are. Even if there's a great interpretation of what's happening right now, there might not be a moment from now. And so the guess here is that this experience of your interpretation of the world changing somehow out from under you may very well be a process that's a lot like turning up and down the temperature in a stochastic optimization, simulated annealing algorithm. Yeah, so I mean, I fiddled with different things here. You know, so in one version of this, I literally used a 10 hertz oscillator for the variance on the noise, thinking about that as being maybe like these brain rhythms that you measure with EEG. But you know, I also just did it with pink noise, with one over F fractal noise, or with some combination of them. You just need something that's that's non-stationary. But it's a great question, and it's kind of like the corollary to the initial hypothesis. If this is right, that the brain uses an active process of adding noise to the neural responses in order to explore different possible interpretations, then there's questions about what are the mechanisms underlying that, what's the time scale or time scales underlying that. I would guess that there might be multiple different time scales that might be driven by multiple different kinds of mechanisms.
So you explained the importance of memory with respect to eye vision, and I've been intrigued in the following situation, putting in another ingredient, which is evolution. The eye is a very primitive part of the organism as well as the brain, and so according as time has been growing, our brain has grown. And so it seems that these patterns that you explain must come from a very primitive stage of evolution. And so, you know, in humans, what is the difference of our functioning of the brain with respect to more primitive life forms?
Okay, that's a biggie. In fact, it's my wife, Jenny, who's the evolutionary biologist, so maybe you can ask her over dinner, and she could give you a better answer, but I can sort of try. It's easiest for me to think about this kind of approach that I talked about here in the context of sensory systems, vision, hearing, and motor control, right? You can, you know, I'm not a pro at that, but I think many of you can sort of see how similar principles could be applied to, you know, to control algorithms, for example, in robotics, right? You know, in which it's already, so in that world, the whole notion that you kind of need to predict forward in time and have internal models that are making predictions, that's standard stuff, okay? So there might be a way to take a formulation like this and bridge over that. The unsubstantiated claim is that we can maybe understand higher level cognitive function using the same toolkit of core computations and algorithms. That's just a hope or a dream. The only evidence for it is that when you look at the circuits, the cell types, the way that they're interconnected in the brain, there are differences from one brain area to the next if you look closely, but there's an awful lot of similarity. So maybe the differences just come down to things like choosing different time constants and different choices of the frequencies in your Fourier basis set, so that these areas that are in prefrontal cortex are all about maintaining information over much longer time periods, but basically do the same kinds of calculations. Now, you know, that's just a guess, and if that's true, or if we can find some evidence that that's even a reasonable approximation or starting point, then you can kind of see how it could evolve gradually in that direction by just basically adding more layers onto your recurrent and recursive neural net that have longer and longer time periods of accumulation and lower and lower frequencies. So, you know, a couple of the projects that people in my lab are working on now are steps toward getting at that. We're trying to build models using this kind of a framework of things like working memory, really kind of longer-term sustained representations in the brain. And we'll see how far we can go with it.